On a quiet evening in the heart of the city, where the hum of car engines and the chatter of passersby formed an ever-changing symphony, a street musician named Elijah sat on his usual corner. His one guitar, the edges smoothed by years of use, rested gently on his knee. The streetlights above cast a soft glow on his dark skin, his fingers moving instinctively over the strings, weaving melodies that danced through the air like whispers of untold stories. Elijah wasn't just another face in the crowd. To those who passed by frequently, he was a staple of the neighborhood, a beacon of warmth in the cold rush of urban life. He wasn't flashy or loud, but there was something about the way he played, the soulful notes and heartfelt lyrics that made people stop. Sometimes, they dropped loose change into his battered case. Other times, they left nothing but a smile or a quick nod of appreciation. For Elijah, it wasn't about the money, it was about connection. That night, as the breeze carried the faint scent of roasted peanuts from a nearby vendor, Elijah noticed a man stumbling down the sidewalk. The man's clothes were disheveled, his steps uneven. From the corner of his eye, Elijah watched as the stranger swayed, then collapsed onto the pavement just a few feet away. The music stopped abruptly, the final note hanging in the air like a question. "Hey, you okay?" Elijah called, setting his guitar aside. He rushed to the man's side, his heart racing. The man's face was pale, his breath shallow, and his lips moved faintly as though trying to form words. Elijah didn't hesitate. Grabbing his phone, he dialed for help, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. In those critical moments, Elijah stayed by the man's side, speaking softly, reassuring him that help was on the way. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics took over, but not before one of them turned to Elijah and said, "You probably just saved this guy's life." Elijah watched the ambulance pull away, his guitar still lying open on the sidewalk. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, worry, and a lingering sense of purpose. Who was this man? What had brought him to such a desperate state? Elijah shook his head, trying to push the questions aside as he picked up his guitar and strummed a quiet tune to calm his thoughts. The next morning, as Elijah prepared to head back to his usual spot, he found an envelope tucked inside his guitar case. He frowned, certain it hadn't been there the night before. The envelope was plain, except for his name written in neat, looping handwriting across the front. His fingers hesitated as he tore it open, a sudden wave of curiosity washing over him. Inside was a letter, the paper slightly crinkled, but the words sharp and deliberate. Elijah began to read, his eyes widening with each sentence. The letter spoke of gratitude, of second chances, and of secrets that would shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Elijah lowered the letter, his mind racing. Who had written it? Was it connected to the man from the night before? And why did it feel like the words on the page were meant to pull him into something much larger than himself? He had no answers, only questions and the faint echo of the melody he had played just hours earlier. Elijah sat at the edge of his small studio apartment, the letter trembling in his hand. The words felt heavy, as if they carried a weight he didn't yet understand. He read it again, slower this time, trying to let each sentence sink in. The writer hadn't signed their name, but they knew details about him, things he didn't share with just anyone. His music, his struggles, even the way he sometimes stayed up late, strumming his guitar under the flickering light of his bedside lamp. It was unsettling, but there was also a strange tenderness in the tone, like the writer wasn't trying to frighten him, but rather guide him toward something. The letter ended with a single line that stood out sharply against the rest. Sometimes saving a life is only the beginning. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if it held answers. Was it from the man he had helped the night before? If so, how had he managed to leave the letter unnoticed? And why not just thank him in person? Questions buzzed in his head like restless bees, but Elijah had no way of piecing the puzzle together. All he had was the letter and the faint memory of the man's pale face and unsteady breathing. The city outside was already alive, the sounds of horns, distant laughter, and hurried footsteps creeping in through his thin walls. Elijah folded the letter carefully, placing it on the small table beside his guitar. His fingers hovered over the strings, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like playing. His mind kept circling back to the man, the moment he collapsed, and the strange sensation Elijah had felt, a tug, like he was meant to be there at that exact time. He decided to head back to his corner, hoping the familiar routine would clear his thoughts. The streets were just as bustling as always, vendors calling out to sell their wares, children laughing as they chased each other, and tourists snapping pictures of anything that seemed remotely interesting. Elijah nodded at a few familiar faces as he set up, carefully placing his guitar case open on the ground. He began to play, letting the melody flow without much thought. It was slower than his usual tunes, a reflective rhythm that mirrored the confusion swirling inside him. People walked by, some tossing a few coins or bills into his case, but Elijah barely noticed. His eyes kept drifting to the crowd, scanning for something or someone. About an hour into his playing, a woman approached. She was in her late 40s, with kind eyes that crinkled at the edges and a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She didn't rush past like most people. Instead, she stopped in front of him, listening intently. When the song ended, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "That was beautiful," she said. "It reminds me of something my father used to play." Elijah gave her a polite smile, not sure what to say. Compliments were nice, but they always felt a little awkward. "Thank you," he said simply, plucking a few notes absent-mindedly. The woman didn't leave. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "You're Elijah, aren't you?" His fingers froze on the strings. He looked up at her, confused. "Yeah, how do you know that?" She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "I think this is for you," she said, handing it to him. "A man gave it to me earlier this morning. He said I'd find you here." Elijah stared at the paper, his heart pounding. It felt too coincidental, too strange, but he unfolded it anyway. The handwriting was the same as the first letter. "Follow the melody. You'll find what you're looking for." No signature, no explanation, just another cryptic message. He looked up at the woman, but she seemed just as confused as he was. "I don't know anything more," she said quickly, almost apologetically. "He just seemed insistent that I pass it along." "Did he say anything about who he was?" Elijah asked. She shook her head. "No, but he looked, I don't know, grateful, I guess, like he owed you something." Elijah nodded slowly, his mind racing. He thanked the woman, who gave him a final, curious glance before walking away. The city seemed to blur around him as he sat there, holding the second note. Follow the melody. What did that even mean? He tried to shake off the unease and started playing again, this time letting his fingers wander over the strings in search of something familiar yet new. The melody that emerged surprised even him. It wasn't one of his usual songs. It felt like it had come from somewhere deep inside, something he hadn't realized was waiting to be played. As the notes filled the air, something strange happened. People began to slow down, not just to listen, but to really stop and take notice. A few even pulled out their phones, recording him with expressions that were a mix of awe and curiosity. Elijah didn't fully understand why, but the melody felt important, like it was drawing him closer to whatever the letters were leading him toward. When he finished, an older man stepped forward from the small crowd that had gathered. His eyes were sharp, almost piercing, and he carried a walking cane with a silver handle. "Where did you learn that song?" the man asked, his voice low but commanding. Elijah blinked, caught off guard. I didn't learn it," he said. "It just came to me." The man's brow furrowed, and he leaned in slightly. "That's not just any tune," he said. "It's a song my grandfather used to play. It's called A Path of Echoes. Not many people know it anymore." Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. "I've never heard of it," he said honestly. "I just played what I felt." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded as if he'd come to a decision. "If you found that song, "You're part of something bigger than you realize," he said. "Be careful. The path it leads you down won't be easy." Before Elijah could ask what he meant, the man turned and walked away, blending into the crowd. Elijah sat there, stunned. The melody, the letters, the strange man. It was all connected somehow, but the pieces didn't fit together yet. He looked down at his guitar, the strings still vibrating faintly from the last note. For the first time in his life, music didn't feel like just a way to express himself. It felt like a key to something hidden, something waiting to be discovered. And Elijah had no choice but to follow where it led. Elijah couldn't shake the man's words. "The path it leads you down won't be easy." They echoed in his mind as he packed up his guitar and walked home. The melody still lingered in his head, looping over and over as if it were trying to guide him somewhere. Every time he thought about it, he felt a pull, a strange, unexplainable urge to keep playing, to let the song unravel whatever secrets it held. But he didn't even know where to start. Back at his apartment, Elijah placed his guitar carefully in the corner and sat at the small table. Both letters lay in front of him, their words almost taunting. He traced his finger over the second note. "Follow the melody. You'll find what you're looking for." What was he even looking for? Answers. Closure. Something about the entire situation felt bigger than him, like he was a small piece in a puzzle he didn't understand. That night, Elijah barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the man he'd helped, the mysterious stranger who had handed the woman the second letter, and the old man who knew the song. It was as if his life had suddenly become entangled with people he didn't know, all connected by threads he couldn't yet see. The next day, Elijah returned to his corner with a strange sense of determination. He didn't know why, but he felt like the answers he needed were tied to that spot. He began to play, letting the same haunting melody flow from his fingers. The crowd was thinner than the day before, but there was still a pull, a quiet energy that seemed to gather as the music filled the air. A young boy stopped in front of him, clutching the hand of an older woman, his grandmother, Elijah guessed. The boy's eyes lit up as he listened, and when the song ended, he tugged at her sleeve. "That's the song, Grandma," he said excitedly. The woman frowned, looking at Elijah with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "What song, sweetie?" she asked. "The one in a dream," the boy said. "I told you about it. The man in the dream played that song." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, in a dream?" he asked, his voice careful. The boy stepped closer, unbothered by the strange look his grandmother was giving him. "I had a dream last week," he said. "There was a man with a guitar, and he played that song. He said it was important." The grandmother's face softened into an uneasy smile. "Kids and their wild imaginations," she said, trying to laugh it off. But Elijah noticed the way her hands tightened on the boy's shoulders, as if she were trying to shield him from something. "Did he say why it was important?" Elijah asked gently, crouching to the boy's level. The boy thought for a moment, his small brow furrowed. "He said it would help people," he said finally. "He said I should remember it, but I didn't know how it went until now." Elijah sat back on his heels, feeling the weight of the boy's words. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, but it still didn't make sense. Why was this song showing up in dreams? What did it mean to help people? And who was the man the boy had seen? The grandmother gave Elijah an apologetic smile, clearly eager to leave. "Thank you for the music," she said quickly, steering the boy away. "Come on, let's get going." Elijah watched them disappear into the crowd, a strange mixture of unease and curiosity swirling in his chest. He felt like he was getting closer to something, but with every step forward, the questions only multiplied. That evening, as he walked home, Elijah noticed a figure standing near his building. It was the old man from the day before, leaning on his cane and staring up at the sky. Elijah hesitated, then approached cautiously. "You again," the man said without looking at him. "I thought you might come back here." Elijah stopped a few feet away, his pulse quickening. "What do you know about this?" he asked. "The song, the letters. What's going on?" The man finally turned to him, his sharp eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You're part of something ancient," he said simply, "something most people have forgotten." Elijah frowned, frustration bubbling up. "That doesn't tell me anything. What am I supposed to do? Why is this happening?" The man sighed, as if the weight of explaining was almost too much. "The melody you're playing is more than just music," he said. "It's a thread, a connection to the lives it touches. When you play it, you're opening a door that some people have been waiting for." "A door to what?" Elijah pressed. "To understanding," the man said. "To healing. To change. But it's not without its risks. There are those who would rather keep those doors closed." The words sent a chill through Elijah. "Who?" he asked. "Why?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "Take this," he said, holding it out. "It won't answer everything, but it'll give you a start." Elijah took the notebook, the leather cool against his fingers. Before he could ask anything else, the man gave him a small nod and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. Back in his apartment, Elijah opened the notebook with trembling hands. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and fragments of writing in a mix of languages. Some of it was music, lines of sheet music that looked eerily similar to the melody he'd been playing. Other pages held cryptic symbols and phrases like the Keeper's Song and the Chain of Echoes. One page in particular caught his eye. It was a list of names, most of them crossed out. At the bottom of the list, written in fresh ink, was his own name, Elijah Carter. The sight of it made his stomach drop. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. He wasn't just a street musician who'd stumbled into something strange. He was a part of it, whether he liked it or not. And for the first time, he realized the melody wasn't just calling to him. It was pulling him into a story far older and far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Elijah couldn't take his eyes off the notebook. His name, written in bold strokes at the bottom of the list, felt like a final piece of evidence confirming what he'd suspected. None of this was an accident. The melody, the letters, the strangers who seemed to know things they shouldn't, it was all part of something bigger. But what exactly that something was still eluded him. The room felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in as his mind raced. He flipped through the notebook again, trying to make sense of the symbols and notes. The sketches seemed to depict places, a crumbling bridge, a winding forest path, and what looked like an old building with a domed roof. None of it was familiar, but something about the images tugged at him, as if they were fragments of a memory he hadn't lived yet. One page had a crude map, drawn hastily with only a few landmarks marked. A red X was scrawled in the corner, next to the words, "Where the echoes converge." The phrase sent a shiver through him, though he couldn't explain why. He traced the lines of the map with his finger, trying to figure out where it led. It wasn't detailed enough to be obvious, but he recognized the general layout. It was somewhere in a city. The next morning, Elijah found himself wandering through the streets, the notebook tucked securely in his bag. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but the red X on the map felt like a challenge, and he couldn't ignore the pull any longer. His guitar was slung over his back, a comforting weight that reminded him of who he was, even as he walked deeper into a mystery that felt more foreign with every step. The city was alive with its usual chaos, honking cars, hurried conversations, the distant thrum of music from a street performer a few blocks away. Elijah's eyes scanned every corner, every building, looking for something that matched the sketches in the notebook. He didn't know how long he'd been walking when he finally spotted it, the domed roof, partially hidden by overgrown vines, exactly as it had been drawn. The building sat at the edge of an abandoned lot, its windows dark and lifeless. Elijah's heart pounded as he approached. The air felt heavier here, as if the space carried a history no one talked about. The front door was locked, but the notebook had shown a side entrance, partially hidden by a crumbling wall. He found it easily, the rusted hinges groaning in protest as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long shadows that danced across the dusty floor. Elijah's footsteps echoed as he walked, each sound amplified in the stillness. He clutched his guitar strap tightly, unsure if he was comforted or unnerved by its presence. In the center of the room was something unexpected, a chair and a small wooden table, almost like a makeshift stage. On the table lay a folded piece of paper. Elijah approached cautiously, his pulse quickening as he picked it up. The handwriting was the same as the letters, looping and precise. It's a reminder. A reminder that you were part of something bigger, and that you have a choice in how you use the melody. Elijah stared at the key, its cool weight in his palm grounding him. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take care, Elijah, and keep listening." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Elijah stood there for a long moment, the key in one hand and his guitar in the other. The city around him felt different now, still chaotic and alive, but with an undercurrent of something more, something hopeful. The next morning, Elijah returned to his usual spot on the street corner. The familiar sounds of the city surrounded him, cars honking, people chatting, footsteps hurrying past. But when he strummed his guitar, the melody that came out wasn't just sound. It was a thread, weaving through the noise and the bustle, touching people in ways they couldn't quite explain. A small crowd began to gather, drawn to the music as if by some invisible force. Among them was the boy from before, the one who'd heard the melody in his dreams. He stood at the edge of the group, his eyes wide and filled with wonder. Elijah caught his gaze and smiled, nodding slightly. The boy grinned back, his hands clutching a notebook as if he were trying to capture the moment. As Elijah played, he felt the connection growing, not just between himself and the crowd, but between the people themselves. Strangers exchanged glances, smiles, even a few quiet words. For a moment, the city's chaos seemed to fade, replaced by something simpler and more profound. When he finished, the crowd applauded, the sound warm and genuine. A few people dropped coins and bills into his guitar case, but Elijah barely noticed. What mattered was the way the melody had flowed, uniting the people around him, if only for a little while. As the crowd dispersed, the boy approached, his notebook clutched tightly to his chest. "That was amazing," he said, his voice shy but earnest. "It felt like the music was talking to me." Elijah smiled, ruffling the boy's hair gently. "That's because it was," he said. "The melody's always been there. You just have to listen." The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful, and ran off to rejoin his family. Elijah watched him go, a faint smile playing on his lips. The melody was safe for now, and as long as he kept playing, it would keep doing what it was meant to do. In the weeks that followed, Elijah's life returned to something resembling normal. He played his guitar on the streets, the melody flowing freely. People came and went, some pausing to listen, others hurrying past. But every now and then, someone would stop, their face lighting up as if they'd found something they didn't know they were looking for. Elijah never saw the man again, nor did he hear from the seekers. But sometimes late at night, he would take out the key and hold it in his hand, letting its weight remind him of the choice he'd made and the journey he'd been on. And though the box was gone, the melody remained, alive, vibrant, and unbroken. It was a force of connection, a thread binding people together in ways they couldn't always see but could always feel. And as long as Elijah kept playing, the melody would continue to weave its magic, one note at a time. As they rounded a corner, Elijah grabbed the man's arm, forcing him to stop. "Wait," he whispered. "Who are they? What's going on?" The man's face was tense, his eyes darting toward the distant noise. "They're called the Seekers," he said quickly. "They've been after the box for years. They think it holds the power to control the melody, to use it for their own ends." Elijah's stomach turned. Control it? What does that even mean? "It's more than a song," the man said. It connects to something ancient, something that binds people and places together. The melody isn't just sound, it's a force. And if they manage to twist it, they could break those connections, disrupt everything. Elijah's head spun. And what about me? Why am I involved in this? The man hesitated, as if unsure how much to say. Because you're one of the few who can hear it for what it really is. The melody responds to you. That's why they'll stop at nothing to find you. Elijah's mouth went dry. The pieces were starting to fit together, but every answer only brought more questions. The footsteps behind them were growing louder now, the voices clearer. There was no time to press for more information. The man grabbed Elijah's arm again, pulling him deeper into the passage. The narrow corridor eventually opened into another room, smaller and less cluttered than the one they'd left behind. A single lantern flickered on a makeshift table, illuminating a map spread across its surface. The man motioned for Elijah to be quiet and closed the door behind them. He pressed his ear to the wood, listening intently. "They're close," he whispered. "We need to move, but first." Before he could finish, the door burst open. Two figures stood in the doorway, their faces obscured by shadows. Elijah instinctively stepped back, gripping his guitar as if it were a shield. The man in front of him straightened, his expression hardening. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low but firm. The figures stepped into the room, their movements deliberate and unhurried. One of them, a tall woman with piercing eyes, fixed her gaze on Elijah. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice calm but edged with menace. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Elijah's throat tightened. Then maybe someone should explain it to me. The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're not ready to understand," she said, "but that doesn't matter. Hand over the box, and we'll leave you alone." Elijah glanced at the man beside him, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Don't listen to them," the man muttered. "They're lying." The second figure, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "This doesn't have to get ugly," he said. "Just give us what we want, and you can walk away." Elijah's mind raced. He didn't even have the box. It was still in the room upstairs. But he could see the tension in the man beside him, the way his hand hovered near his jacket, as if reaching for something. The room felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. "What's in the box?" Elijah asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Why is it so important?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "That's none of your concern." "It is now," Elijah said, surprising himself with the force of his words. "You've dragged me into this, so at least tell me the truth." For a moment, no one moved. The room was so quiet Elijah could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice colder now. "The box contains a key. Not the kind you're thinking of, but a key to unlocking the full power of the melody. With it, the song becomes more than a bridge. It becomes a weapon. That's all you need to know." Elijah felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. A weapon. The melody that had always felt like a lifeline to him, a way to connect with others, could be twisted into something destructive. He thought of the boy who'd heard it in a dream, the strangers who'd been drawn to it, the way it had seemed to bring hope to people on the street. How could something so beautiful be turned into a weapon? Before he could say anything, the man beside him moved. In one swift motion, he pulled a small object from his jacket and threw it to the ground. There was a flash of light, followed by a cloud of smoke that filled the room. Elijah coughed, his eyes stinging, as the man grabbed his arm and pulled him toward another door he hadn't noticed before. "Run!" the man shouted, his voice muffled by the chaos. Elijah didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled through the door, the sound of shouting behind him growing fainter as they ran. The passage they entered was narrow and winding, the walls damp and uneven. Elijah's heart pounded as they turned corner after corner, his mind racing just as fast. Every step felt like it was pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape. Finally, they emerged into the open air, The city's sounds and lights a stark contrast to the darkness they'd just left behind. Elijah leaned against a wall, gasping for breath, while the man scanned the area, his expression grim. "They won't stop," the man said. "Not until they have the box, or you." Elijah looked at him, his chest heaving. "Then what do we do?" The man met his gaze, his eyes full of a seriousness that made Elijah's stomach drop. "We find the box first," he said, "and we make sure it never falls into their hands, no matter what it takes." The city felt colder, the night wrapping around Elijah and the man as they moved quickly through the narrow streets. The weight of the situation pressed down on Elijah's chest like a boulder. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, the questions swirling in his mind, only adding to the pressure. What was the melody's true purpose? Could he really stop the seekers? And what would happen if he failed? They slipped into an abandoned subway station, the entrance hidden beneath a crumbling overpass. The man led the way, his movements sharp and deliberate. Elijah followed, clutching his guitar like a lifeline. The station was eerily quiet, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the cavernous space. In the center of the platform, there was an old trunk, its surface scratched and worn with age. "It's here," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. He crouched beside the trunk, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was the box, the intricate carvings on its surface catching the dim light. Elijah stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. "So this is it," he said, "the thing everyone's been chasing." The man nodded. "This box has been protected for centuries, and now it's up to you to decide what happens next." Elijah frowned. "Why me? I didn't ask for this." "You didn't have to," the man said, standing and facing him. "The melody chose you. It responds to you in ways it doesn't with anyone else. That's why the Seekers want you. With you, they can unlock the box and control its power. Without you, it's just an empty shell." Elijah stared at the box, his mind racing. He didn't feel chosen. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. But as he looked at the carvings, he felt something stir inside him, a faint, inexplicable pull, as if the box was calling to him. Before he could say anything, the sound of footsteps echoed through the station. Elijah's heart leaped into his throat. The Seekers had found them. The man grabbed the box and thrust it into Elijah's hands. "Go," he said urgently. "Take the back tunnel. I'll hold them off." "What? No," Elijah protested. "I can't leave you here." "You don't have a choice," the man said firmly. "If they catch you, it's over. Now go." Elijah hesitated for a moment, then turned and ran. The box felt heavier with every step, its weight not physical, but something deeper, more intangible. The tunnel was dark and winding, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. Behind him, he could hear shouts and the faint echo of footsteps growing closer. Finally, he emerged into an open space, a hidden chamber beneath the city, its walls covered in the same symbols that adorned the box. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal, eerily similar to the one in the abandoned building. Elijah placed the box on the pedestal, his hands shaking. The carvings on the box began to glow, faint at first, then brighter and brighter until the entire chamber was bathed in golden light. The melody filled the air, not from his guitar but from everywhere at once, as if the very walls were singing. It was haunting and beautiful, unlike anything Elijah had ever heard. As the light intensified, a figure appeared, a shimmering, translucent form that seemed to step out of the melody itself. It was an older woman, her presence both serene and commanding. She looked at Elijah with a mixture of warmth and sadness. "You've done well to bring the box here," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed to blend with the melody. "But the choice remains yours." Elijah blinked, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "What choice?" he asked. "I don't understand any of this." "The melody is a force of connection," the woman said. "It can bring people together, heal wounds, and create harmony. But in the wrong hands, it can be turned into a weapon of division and destruction. The box contains the key to its full power. You must decide whether to unlock it and let the melody reach its true potential or to seal it away forever, keeping it from those who would misuse it. Elijah's heart raced. The weight of the decision felt overwhelming. "What happens if I unlock it?" he asked. "That depends on you," the woman said. "The melody will reflect your intentions. But know this, once unlocked, it cannot be contained again." The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Elijah knew he didn't have much time. His mind raced through everything he'd experienced: the strangers drawn to the melody, the boy whose life had been saved, the way the song had always felt like a part of him. He thought about the seekers and their desire for control, the man who'd risked everything to help him, and the countless lives that could be affected by his decision. Finally, he made his choice. Elijah reached out and placed his hands on the box. The carvings pulsed with light, and the melody swelled, filling the chamber with a crescendo so powerful it seemed to shake the ground. The glow enveloped him, and for a moment, he felt as if he were part of the music itself, every note, every connection, every possibility. When the light faded, Elijah was alone. The box was gone, the chamber silent. He stood there for a long moment, trying to catch his breath. The weight he'd been carrying was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. As he made his way back to the surface, he found the man waiting for him, battered but alive. The seekers were nowhere to be seen. "What happened?" the man asked, his voice filled with awe. Elijah smiled faintly, his guitar slung over his shoulder. "I think I finally understand the melody," he said, "and I think it's going to be okay." But as they walked away, a faint, haunting echo of the melody lingered in the air, a reminder that the story wasn't entirely over. Somewhere, someone else might hear it, and when they did, their own journey would begin. The city's quiet seemed heavier as Elijah and the man walked through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing softly. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on Elijah, yet there was also a strange lightness inside him, as if the melody had lifted something he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The man, whose name Elijah still didn't know, glanced over at him. "You did it, didn't you? Whatever choice you made back there, I can feel it. The air's different." Elijah nodded, gripping the neck of his guitar like it was an anchor. "I don't know if I did the right thing," he admitted, "but it felt like the only choice." The man offered a small smile, wary but sincere. "That's how it usually feels when you're standing in the middle of something bigger than yourself. You did what you had to, and that's all anyone can ask." They walked in silence for a while, the streetlights casting long shadows. Elijah thought about everything he'd seen: the glowing carvings on the box, the woman who had appeared from the melody, the way the song had filled the air with such beauty and power. He thought about the seekers, their relentless pursuit of control, and the way the melody had seemed to resist them, as if it had a will of its own. Eventually, they reached the corner where Elijah had first met the man. The spot where he'd been playing his guitar felt like a lifetime ago. Elijah stopped, looking down at the scuffed pavement. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. The man looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Now you go back to your music," he said. "The melody isn't gone, Elijah. It's still out there, still part of you. And as long as you keep playing, it'll keep connecting people, in small ways and big ones." Elijah frowned. "But what about the seekers? Won't they keep coming?" "They won't stop looking," the man admitted. "But without the box, they can't manipulate the melody. And after what you did, I think they'll have a hard time finding anyone else who can unlock its secrets. You've bought the world some time." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was enough for now. Elijah nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He didn't fully understand the role he'd played or the consequences of his decision, but he knew one thing: the melody was meant to connect, not control, and as long as he had his guitar, he would keep playing it for that purpose. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, pressing it into Elijah's hand. It was a simple key, old and slightly tarnished. "Keep this," he said. "It's not for a door. It's a reminder." a reminder that you were part of something bigger and that you have a choice in how you use the melody. Elijah stared at the key, its cool weight in his palm grounding him. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take care, Elijah, and keep listening." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Elijah stood there for a long moment, the key in one hand and his guitar in the other. The city around him felt different now, still chaotic and alive, but with an undercurrent of something more, something hopeful. The next morning, Elijah returned to his usual spot on the street corner. The familiar sounds of the city surrounded him, cars honking, people chatting, footsteps hurrying past. But when he strummed his guitar, the melody that came out wasn't just sound. It was a thread, weaving through the noise and the bustle, touching people in ways they couldn't quite explain. A small crowd began to gather, drawn to the music as if by some invisible force. Among them was the boy from before, the one who'd heard the melody in his dreams. He stood at the edge of the group, his eyes wide and filled with wonder. Elijah caught his gaze and smiled, nodding slightly. The boy grinned back, his hands clutching a notebook as if he were trying to capture the moment. As Elijah played, he felt the connection growing, not just between himself and the crowd, but between the people themselves. Strangers exchanged glances, smiles, even a few quiet words. For a moment, the city's chaos seemed to fade, replaced by something simpler and more profound. When he finished, the crowd applauded, the sound warm and genuine. A few people dropped coins and bills into his guitar case, but Elijah barely noticed. What mattered was the way the melody had flowed, uniting the people around him, if only for a little while. As the crowd dispersed, the boy approached, his notebook clutched tightly to his chest. "That was amazing," he said, his voice shy but earnest. "It felt like the music was talking to me." Elijah smiled, ruffling the boy's hair gently. "That's because it was," he said. "The melody's always been there, you just have to listen." The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful, and ran off to rejoin his family. Elijah watched him go, a faint smile playing on his lips. The melody was safe for now, and as long as he kept playing, it would keep doing what it was meant to do. In the weeks that followed, Elijah's life returned to something resembling normal. He played his guitar on the streets, the melody flowing freely. People came and went, some pausing to listen, others hurrying past. But every now and then, someone would stop, their face lighting up, as if they'd found something they didn't know they were looking for. Elijah never saw the man again, nor did he hear from the seekers. But sometimes late at night, he would take out the key and hold it in his hand, letting its weight remind him of the choice he'd made and the journey he'd been on. And though the box was gone, the melody remained, alive, vibrant, and unbroken. It was a force of connection, a thread binding people together in ways they couldn't always see but could always feel. And as long as Elijah kept playing, the melody would continue to weave its magic, one note at a time.